Chapter 38. Relative clauses of characteristic, relative clauses of purpose, and subordinate clauses in indirect discourse. Chapter 38 covers the following: relative clauses of characteristic and purpose, abbreviated RCC and RCP, subordinate clauses in indirect discourse, abbreviated SCID, the datives of reference and purpose, and at the end of the lesson we'll review the vocabulary, which you should memorize in this chapter. There are 4 important rules to remember in this chapter. Rule 1. Relative clauses with subjunctive verbs show characteristic or purpose. Rule 2. Subordinate clauses in indirect discourse often have subjunctive verbs. Rule 3. The dative case shows reference. And Rule 4. The double dative consists of a dative of reference plus a dative of purpose. Relative clauses of characteristic. You remember what relative clauses are, right? Clauses that begin who, which, what, that. As in, these are clauses which begin with relative pronouns like who, which, what, that. And do you remember the term for the noun outside the relative clause to which the relative pronoun refers? Yes, it's antecedent. When a relative clause has a clear and specific antecedent, that's the sort of antecedent we've been dealing with ever since you learned about relative clauses in Chapter 17. The verb in the relative clause is indicative, which makes perfect sense. If something seems clear and factual to the speaker, it's only logical to use the indicative. But what if the antecedent's not clear? Relative clauses can also describe a type of person or thing, as in, here's the type of person who would have done it. He didn't necessarily do it, but he's that sort of person. Look at that sneer, he's totally evil. So, what do you do in Latin when the antecedent isn't specific? What mood of verb should the relative clause use? The subjunctive, of course, which in this case generalizes the antecedent. It can also show purpose, as we'll see in a second. Generalizing the antecedent is a natural extension of the subjunctive's basic sense of uncertainty. Let's look into this type of syntax a little more closely. In a regular relative clause, one that uses the indicative, the antecedent is specific, a clear, real thing you can point at. For instance, here's the poem which you like. In Latin, the verb like will be indicative because the poem under discussion is a real and specific one. The Aeneid, for instance. If you haven't read it already, you're going to love it. Everyone does. But make the verb in the relative clause subjunctive, and the antecedent is no longer specific. For instance, I know the type of poem which you like. I'm not thinking about a specific one. I just know you like sonnets. Here's a book of sonnets by Shakespeare. I'll bet you love them too. You better, they're great. Let's look at what this will look like in Latin. A regular relative clause like he is the man who did it will be vir est qui id fecit. The verb fecit is indicative, indicating that he's the man who actually did it. A relative clause of characteristic, let's call them RCCs for the sake of brevity. An RCC, like he is the type of man who would have done it, will have a subjunctive verb and look like this: vir est qui id fecerit. By changing the verb into the subjunctive fecerit, the meaning of the sentence changes too. Now it means he's the type of person who would have done it. But whether or not he actually did this exact particular thing is not clear. What the relative clause is saying now is, I don't have solid evidence he did it, but he can't be counted out as a suspect. There is another type of relative clause that also uses the subjunctive, the relative clause of purpose, RCP. Regular positive purpose clauses, as we saw back in Chapter 28, use ut. For example, virum misi ut tecum loqueretur, meaning I sent a man to speak with you. RCPs make one simple change. They replace ut with a relative pronoun form like qui. For instance, vira misi qui tecum loqueretur, meaning basically the same thing. I sent a man to, literally who was to, speak with you. Since Wheelock doesn't discuss RCPs at all in his textbook, let's look at a few examples of this construction. You are responsible for knowing it in this class. First sentence. Quo stam misit qui hostes interficerent, meaning he sent some men to kill the enemy. Literally, who would or were to kill the enemy. Here's another example. Haec habebat quae de senectute diceret, meaning he had these things to say about old age. Literally, which he would or wanted to say about old age. And a third example. Dignus est qui exercitui imperet, meaning he is worthy to command an army. Literally, he is a worthy man who would or could command an army. One minor point, if an RCP has a comparative form in it, Latin uses quo, as in scutum dejecit quo calarius fugeret, meaning he threw down his shield in order to run away faster. Literally, by which the faster he might run away. Note that RCCs and RCPs are similar in another respect. They both build on the subjunctive's original sense of uncertainty. That is, he's the type of person who would have done it. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't, but you can't count him out. Or, he's the person I sent to do it, but I'm not saying he actually completed the task. Both show uncertainty. There is yet a third kind of relative clause, which takes a subjunctive verb, but this one doesn't reflect uncertainty. Instead, it incorporates the newer use of the subjunctive in classical times to show subordination. This type occurs when a relative clause is embedded within another clause or construction. This syntax inside syntax situation happens most often when the antecedent of a relative clause is some component of indirect discourse. In this case, there is not necessarily anything uncertain about the information in the relative clause. The antecedent isn't being generalized. The outcome of the verb's action is not questionable in any way. The verb is subjunctive because the larger grammar around it, the syntax it's inside, is complicated. Students in past classes of mine jokingly referred to this as the subjunctive in deep syntax. Inelegant, but not inaccurate. Underlying this phenomenon is a principle called hypercorrection, in which speakers import a linguistic rule or feature associated elsewhere with good grammar into a context where it does not apply and often produces bad grammar. The classic example in English is between you and I. Between you and me is correct, in that the preposition between calls for the objective case, as is easily seen when the pronouns are reversed. Few English speakers would say, between I and you. One factor driving hypercorrection is the speaker's wish to sound correct, and knowing that other uses of me, such as me and him went home, are looked down on as substandard speech, some English speakers will use I instead of me broadly, even when the objective for me is in fact called for. Hypercorrection is also probably a major factor, if not the major factor, driving subordinate clauses in indirect discourse in Latin. Let's make our lives easier and call that SCID, or SCID. As subordination and complex syntax began to develop in Latin, some Romans made verbs subjunctive when there was no need or precedent to do so, because, well, lots of smart people were using subjunctives in fancy schmancy new-fangled clauses, so subjunctives obviously made you sound hip, and besides, Everything around the clause is subjunctive anyway, so come on, Mom, all the cool verbs are doing it. Peer pressure can be a mighty force. Which raises an important issue. If a clause is inside some sort of construction which doesn't have an indicative verb, should the clause be non-indicative too? Should it be subjunctive just because its immediate neighbors are? Just exactly this happens sometimes in Latin, a principle grammarians call subjunctive by attraction. Almost certainly another factor driving skids, and indeed the whole shift in the use of the subjunctive as a way of indicating subordination, not just uncertainty. While Wheelock doesn't address skids as such in the main part of his textbook, he does include them in the supplementary syntax on page 378. Let's look at the examples he provides there. Please remember, you're responsible for knowing this type of subordinate clause, which shows up not at all infrequently in Latin. The first sentence at the top of page 378 contains a regular relative clause. Legit libros quos miseras, meaning he read the books which you had sent. Miseras, you had sent, is indicative, the way you would expect a verb in a relative clause to be. You actually sent the books. There's nothing uncertain about that. So, of course, the verb is indicative. But put the relative clause inside more complicated syntax, like dixit se legissi libros quos misisses, meaning he said that he had read the books which you had sent, and the verb miseras will become subjunctive misisses just because the clause is now inside indirect statement. There's still nothing uncertain about your having sent the books. The only difference between the regular relative clause and the skid is that the grammar around the skid is more complicated, and complicated grammar has begun to be associated with subjunctive in the Roman mind. Here's another example of a skid. First, the regular form of the relative clause. Ei mali, qui in urbe manent infirmi erunt sine duce, meaning those evil men who remain in the city, note that manent, remain, is indicative, will be weak without their leader. Now here's the skid form of the relative clause. Puto eos malos, qui in urbe maneant, infirmi futuros esse sine duce, meaning, I think that those evil men who remain in the city will be weak without their leader. Now remain is subjunctive, maneant, because the relative clause is inside another construction, indirect statement again. While skids are often relative clauses, that's not the only type of construction which can be hypercorrected into the subjunctive. Conditions can too. For instance, si id credet errabit, meaning, if he believes this, he will be wrong. This is a standard condition, a future more vivid, in which the future indicative is used in the protasis, credet. But put the condition inside indirect statement, and it becomes a skid. For example, dico si id credat eum erraturum esse, meaning, I say that, if he believes this, he will be wrong. Now the verb in the protasis is subjunctive, credat. Note the sense of this condition is not changed into future less vivid, should would, the type of condition which uses the present subjunctive normally, which means sometimes it's hard to tell exactly how to read the subjunctive. Is the subjunctive here saying FLV or skid? Or both? When this sort of thing happens in a real Latin text, different scholars will explain the mood of the verb different ways. But know this, in this class, if you ever provide a correct possible explanation, you will always receive full credit. I will never deduct points from your score if you disagree with me, only with the rules. And when the rules are not completely clear, you get to choose whichever right answer you find most appealing. The upshot of all of this is that when a Latin verb is subjunctive, there are three new answers to the question, what, mood, and why. RCC, relative clause of characteristic, when the antecedent of the relative pronoun is generalized, that is, the type who. RCP, relative clause of purpose, when the relative pronoun is used in place of ut in a purpose clause. And skid, a subordinate clause in indirect discourse, when the clause is embedded in some sort of other subordinate construction, and there's no other reason, like a sense of uncertainty, for the verb to be subjunctive other than it's in deep syntax. To end the grammar in this chapter, let's take a final look at the dative case and its usages. As we bring our study of Latin grammar to a close, what we're really doing here is mopping up the last little bits of syntax involving the cases of nouns. We're done with the nominative and accusative, we've looked at all their major uses, and in the last chapter, chapter 40, we'll clean up the genitive and the ablative. Here we'll finish up the dative. When it all comes down to it, if there's one guiding sense that underlies all datives, it's reference. Reference is the dative's basic use. All datives fundamentally, one way or another, show reference. That is, the perspective from which an action or thought is seen. Indirect objects, for instance, show from whose perspective there was benefit in some act of giving. She gave me a gift means her giving of the gift was a benefit from my perspective, because I was the recipient of her largesse. Likewise, datives with certain adjectives show who is affected by the adjective, as in, she was kind to me, or true or loyal. She may have been a complete monster to others, but seen from my reference point, she was always really kind. Even the dative of possession can be viewed this way. There is a book to me means at heart that the book exists as far as I'm concerned, because I own it and I can use it any way I like. So for me, it's a real thing. Since it's not yours, it really doesn't exist for you, or at least it doesn't matter whether it exists or not from your perspective, because you can't use it. It's mine, which is good for me, the dative of advantage, and bad for you, the dative of disadvantage. Those are two other usages of the dative. But sometimes the relationship between the dative and the rest of the sentence isn't easy to put into any clear category. There's no word like give or good to tie the dative to. Sometimes the dative just shows the way someone sees something. For instance, it looks fine to me. It's not that it's fine for me. Fine is just the way I see it. Or hear it. It sounds right to me. That doesn't necessarily mean I like it, only that I don't see any problem with it. From my vantage point, it seems right. That's the dative in its purest form, the so-called dative of reference, which should only ever be used as a term if there's no other way to classify a dative noun. Advantage, disadvantage, possession, with certain adjectives, with special verbs, and of course, indirect object. If none of those apply, you can say dative of reference, since all datives fundamentally show reference, but only when you're that desperate can you use the term reference and be correct. When you can be more specific about the dative's use or connotation, then don't say reference, except in one construction, when it's paired with the dative of purpose, another important use of the dative, which Wheelock includes in the supplementary syntax on page 375. The dative of purpose shows the reason someone did something, or what the goal of some action was. For instance, he went to the store for ice cream. For ice cream, a dative states the goal of the action, the reason he went to the store. In sense, it's the equivalent of a purpose clause. He went to the store in order that he purchase ice cream, or for the purpose of buying ice cream. Quite often the noun used as a dative of purpose is an abstract noun, as in, we did it for profit, for pleasure, for fun, for love. For instance, we dated for fun, but married for love. And that's the way you'll see it in one of its most important applications in Latin, the double dative, a combination of the dative of purpose and the dative of reference. For example, the way the Romans would have said money is a concern to a fool alone is money is for or as a concern to a fool alone. In Latin that would be pecunia est curae stulto soli. Both curae and stulto are dative. Curae, meaning a concern, an abstract noun, is a dative of purpose, and stulto, fool, is the dative of reference. In the double dative, the dative of reference is almost always a person or persons. Here's another example of the double dative. Venerunt auxilio mihi, meaning they have come to give help to me, literally, as a help or for help to me. Here, auxilio, the abstract noun, is the dative of purpose, and mihi, the person, is the dative of reference. One last thing to note about this construction, it's rare to see the double dative used with verbs other than some form of esse, to be, or a verb of motion. And that is as an end to the grammar in this chapter. Now all that remains for you is the vocabulary, to which the first word is consul, consulis, masculine, meaning consul, a third declension, non-I stem noun. In antiquity, a consul held the consulship, the highest executive office in the Roman government, the top of the cursus honorum, the path of public offices. It was a seat sought by many ambitious Romans until Augustus turned Rome into an empire, stripping all elected offices of any real power. Then being consul was still an honor, but a honor sine potestate. The next word is dolor, doloris, masculine. Remember, all third declension nouns that end or oris, like amor, amoris, are masculine. Dolor means pain or grief, another third declension non-I stem noun, and was what many lovers of republican government in Rome felt when Augustus did what he did. What they really felt was odium odii neuter, meaning hatred or boredom, a second declension noun. Here comes a very important word, opus operis neuter, meaning work, task, deed, or accomplishment. It's a third declension neuter noun. It isn't I stem either. I stem so far are batting 0 here. Opus is part of an idiom seen widely in Latin. Opus est, meaning there is need. Literally, there is work. In other words, there's work to be done here. That is, you need to get on it. Opus est is usually followed by one of two constructions. A dative plus an infinitive, for instance, opus est ei abiri, literally, there is need for him to depart, or a subjunctive without ut, as in opus est abeat, meaning basically the same thing as its dative plus infinitive counterpart. There is need that he depart, that is, it's time for him to scram. Note that this subjunctive alternative is at heart a paratactic construction. Literally, there is need, let him depart. The subjunctive was originally adjussive. Note also, it will follow sequence of tenses. Make it past, and the subjunctive verb will have to become imperfect. Opus erat ab iret. There was need that he depart. Next up is qua re, meaning wherefore or why. It can function as an adverb or a conjunction. Literally it means because of which qua, thing, re. It was originally an ablative of cause. Sit back down, we'll get to that eventually. Qua re often introduces questions, both direct and indirect, and also relative clauses, in which case you should translate it as "for which reason." If so, it's functionally the equivalent of because. And let's be clear about one thing here that has nothing to do with Latin. The English word wherefore does not mean where. It means why. It's the correlative of therefore. Wherefore, therefore, meaning why, because. So when Juliet in Shakespeare's masterpiece asks herself, "O Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo?" she's not asking where he is. She doesn't know he's lurking in the garden below at that very moment listening to her. She's asking herself why he has the name Romeo, because their names are really all that stand between them and love's blessed bliss. Wheelock would probably have been wiser just to say quare means why and leave it at that. I love teaching Latin. English drives me crazy. Here's a verb, consumo, consumere, consumsi, consumptum, meaning consume or eat up. It's third conjugation, a compound of con, with, here in the sense completely, and sumo, meaning take, which is the next word, consumo's base verb, sumo, sumere, sumsi, sumptum, meaning, as I just said, take. It's third conjugation. Be sure you learn sumo. Not only is it commonly used in Latin, but it also produced a raft of compounds, which in turn produced a boatload of English derivatives, like resumo, take back, recover, or resume, praesumo, take before, take for granted, or presume, and assumo, that's odd, meaning to plus sumo, take to, take up, adopt, or assume. The P in the perfect forms of sumo, sumsi, and sumptum, which shows up in consumo's perfect too, is there just to ease pronunciation. It's hard to say sumsi without inserting a P, sumpsi. Here's another verb, defendo, defendere, defendi, defensum, meaning ward off, defend, or protect. It's a third conjugation verb. Note that its base is the same in the present and perfect. And since it's also third, so its thematic vowel is I, some of its forms will look the same in these tenses. So what does defend it mean? Or should I say, what do defend it mean? He defends, or he has defended. And defendimus? We defend, or we have defended. So what about defendet? What does E mean in third? I know you know this by now, come on. It's future. So, he will defend. Now here's a really interesting verb. Dubito, first conjugation, meaning doubt or hesitate. It's made up of dub, meaning to, and ito, a type of verbal suffix called a frequentative, which adds a sense to the verb's basic action that it's happening frequently or repeatedly. So dubito means literally go in two directions back and forth. Is that not a perfect way to describe hesitation? I'll go that way. No, wait, I should go this way. But doesn't that way make more sense still? This way would be faster. Faster's better, right? No, right's righter. Let's do this right. Or left. Maybe I should just sit here for a while and dubitate. Latin is replete with frequentatives, an increasingly popular form as Latin evolved after the classical age. And what's most wonderful about them is they're almost all first conjugation and regular. Ito, itare, itavi, itatum. Learn that pattern, and you've mastered 100 verbs, such as agito, agitare, agitavi, agitatum, meaning not just to agere, to do or drive, but to be busy with, hunt, or vex, literally drive back and forth, do over and over. Or ventito, meaning not just come, but keep coming. Cursito, run up and down, and factito, do often, often with the sense practice as a profession. Not all frequentatives are regular, however. For instance, some frequentatives based on deponents created deponent frequentatives, especially those verbs which were very commonly used and heard often as deponents, like loquor, which spawned a frequentative loquitor, loquitari, talk a lot, chatter, and sector, sectari, run after, harass, or stalk, the frequentative of sequor. It's often the case that these frequentatives, popular as they were in later Latin, were handed down to the Romance languages in place of their base verbs. From there the frequentative, not the base verb, entered English. Such is the case with two terms we've previously encountered, dubitative and factative, both of which no doubt caused you some agitation. Why frequentatives were so popular and sometimes displaced their base verbs, the linguist L.R. Palmer explains, quote, "Colloquial language is characterized, of course, by its preference for colorful and drastic expressions, which with the change of generations lose their force and emphasis. A child who first and constantly hears mug for face will in all innocence use it as the normal expression." End quote. Indeed, according to some scholars, mug derives from drinking vessels shaped with grotesque faces, a novelty item popular in the 19th century. This joking use of mug for face was given new life in the 1950s with the expression mugshot, a police photograph of a criminal, typically an unflattering one. Here's a verb, metuo, metuere, metui, meaning fear or dread, a third conjugation verb. There's no fourth principal part for this verb because it has no true passive. Make note that it often is followed by a fearing clause, the type of ne or ut clause I introduced in chapter 36, but which you haven't been able to practice much because Wheelock doesn't formally introduce this construction in the main part of his textbook. So let's practice your fearing clauses again. How would Latin say, "They feared that I might not come"? Don't forget the ne and ut situation with fearing clauses. Which means that, and which means that not. They're reversed. So which do you want here in this negative fearing clause? Ut, that's right. And do fearing clauses follow sequence of tenses? Yes, they do. So the answer is metuerunt, or metuebant, ut venirem. Imperfect subjunctive showing contemporaneous action in secondary sequence. Remember the paratactic origin of fearing clauses. Early Romans would have heard this sentence as, "They were afraid, how they wished that I might come." The next word, fatum fati neuter, meaning fate, is a second declension noun. It's actually the perfect passive participle of a deponent verb we haven't studied, but probably should have, seeing as it's very widely used in Latin, for fari, fatus sum, meaning speak. You've seen the base fa in fama, meaning rumor, and fateor, meaning confess. So fatum, neuter singular, is literally the thing having been spoken. That is, that which was said, with the implication said by the gods. If the gods say it, it's going to happen. That's just the way it works, in the Roman mind at least. What would be the accusative plural of fatum? Good for you, it's neuter, fata. And the last word on this vocabulary list, pes pedis, masculine, meaning foot. It's a third declension, masculine noun. And is it I-stem? No, it's not. It is monosyllabic, but there's only one consonant at the end of the base. So that's 3 strikes for I-stems in this vocabulary. Actually, 4. I is out of the game. What would be the English cognate of this base? Remember Grimm's law. Latin P is equal to English F. like pater and father. Latin D is equal to English T, like dent and tooth. So change P to F and D to T, and you get foot. You probably don't need that to remember what pes pedis means, but isn't it nice to know? How would Latin say on foot? What does on foot mean? You're using your foot, right? So what case, in what usage, shows the instrument employed to do something? The ablative of means, of course. So on foot in Latin is pede, no preposition. Done and done. Do the rules that were cited at the beginning of this chapter now make sense to you? If not, please review this presentation. If so, please proceed to the next slide. For the next class meeting, please bring in a copy of the practice and review sentences for Chapter 38 on pages 184 and 185 of Wheelock's text. Quos diament Latinae student.